Okay, so this evening, I want to talk about Planet of the Apes because it is the most perverse of the tentpole science fiction franchises. It's just weird if you think about it. It's been going for 52 years, and that has a kind of knock-on effect. Well, why is the Planet of the Apes franchise still happening? Why have they announced, now that Disney has bought Fox, why have they announced that they're going to make another Planet of the Apes movie? Why have they attached a director to it? What is it about the Planet of the Apes that makes it a franchise that just won't die? Well, part of it, before I talk about Planet of the Apes, I need to talk a bit about the history of gorillas in popular culture, because the gorilla is an important part of this. The gorilla is an image that, through the 20th century particularly, people have really wanted to see in things, and really, that starts with the eighth wonder of the world, King Kong. King Kong, 1933, and here he is holding Fay Ray and on top of the building. And King Kong came back. King Kong comes back in 1962. The Japanese film company Toho bought the rights to King Kong and made Godzilla versus King Kong. And then they made where King Kong gets to fight Godzilla. And it's only like the third Godzilla movie. You know, given that there's actually like 35 Godzilla movies so far, the fact that King Kong pops up in the third one, I think should give you some sort of idea of how important he is. In 1967, you have King Kong Escapes, which includes, among King Kong's giant monster opponents, Mecha Kong, right there, and you can sort of see him there, the robot King Kong. They do like their mecha monsters. On Saturday morning TV in 1966, you had the King Kong Show, a cartoon. In 1976, they remade King Kong, only with Jessica Lange instead of Fay Ray. In 2005, it's Naomi Watts instead of Fay Ray, and you've got Adrian Brody and Jack Black in this version. And then in 2017, they rebooted it with a film set during the Vietnam War, Kong Skull Island, and here is Brie Larson and Tom Hiddleston. And again, King Kong each time has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, I mean, compared to how big he is with Fay Ray and how big he is with Jessica Lange and how big he is, he's getting progressively huger, to the extent that next year we're going to be seeing Godzilla versus King Kong. And look how big Godzilla is and how big King Kong is. It's like Godzilla is, according to the old theme song, up 20 stories high, breathing fire, his head in the sky. Actually breathes radioactive beams of death. King Kong is also, it seems, 20 stories high here, which is wild. It's not the only gorilla in popular culture. So in 1949, you have Mighty Joe Young, which is an early film from Ray Harryhausen. You know, Jason the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, Sinbad movies. But in 1949, Mighty Joe Young, which is another movie about a giant gorilla who befriends a child. You see it in Pulp Fiction as well. So Lovecraft has a gorilla story. It's actually was first published as The White Ape in 1924. It's now in collections as The Facts Concerning Arthur Jermyn and his family, and it's about a man who discovers that his great-grandmother was a white gorilla, and that his great-granddad did the nasty with an ape. And that's absolutely not a racist metaphor. No, sorry, it is a racist metaphor because it's Lovecraft. But yeah, you see, it's a gorilla story. Even Lovecraft has a gorilla story, and you see loads of them there. I found an entire blog that has nothing but pages and pages and pages of pulp fantasy and comic book covers with gorillas on. Right, the internet. It's a beautiful thing. And this is my favourite, Fantastic Adventures, May 1940, and we have The Whispering Gorilla by Don Wilcox, and it's a gorilla in a dinner jacket and a white tie, which is wonderful, really. DC Comics had a period where they had gorillas pretty much every month on one comic or another. And this started in 1951 with Strange Adventures #8. So you have this, the incredible story of an ape with a human brain. This is apparently the most popular edition of a comic that DC had ever sold up to that point. And the editor-in-chief, Julius Schwartz, realized that actually gorillas were something that people really wanted, and they started bringing gorillas in whenever they possibly could. Schwartz had to introduce a rule that said they weren't actually allowed to have more than one gorilla cover published in any given month, because it just got ridiculous. And this went on for about 15-20 years. So another example is the regular villain of The Flash, Gorilla Grodd, who is a superpowered telepathic genius gorilla scientist from a gorilla city. And this is a thing. This is very much a thing. You have gorillas on kids' TV. We had the King Kong cartoon, but you also have the Great Grape Ape from the 1970s, who's a Hanna-Barbera character. And his fundamental thing, he's got a friend who's a dog, and he means well, the Grape Ape, but every time he goes somewhere, people run away in terror because he's about 15 feet high and he's a purple gorilla because he's kind of grape-colored. All of these things are basically secondary, really, because of one man. One man basically makes apes a thing that lasts, and that one man is Pierre Boulle, the French novelist. And Boulle he fought in the Second World War, actually, and he was, quite the badass, actually, but he is best known for 2 novels. Now, one novel, and his first really popular novel, was filmed in 1957. It's The Bridge on the River Kwai. But his other most popular novel is La Planète des Singes, which we translate as either Planet of the Apes, or, as it was first translated into English, Monkey Planet, because the word singe in French means both monkey and ape. They don't have a separate word for them, which is apparently also true in German. And in the novel, La Planète des Singes, in the novel, you have the narrator, Ulysse Meroux, except you don't have the narrator. What you do is you have a married couple who are on a holiday in their spaceship, and they're flying around the galaxy, and they find a message in a bottle. And the message in the bottle is the manuscript of Ulysse Meroux, who is a journalist who went on an interstellar trip, an exploratory trip with a Professor Antel and an Arthur Levin. And they go to a planet they call Soror, which is a sister planet to the Earth. And they discover that it's a planet where apes are smart and humans are stupid, and humans don't talk. And on planet Soror, Ulysse gets separated from Professor Antel and from Arthur Levan. Arthur Levan ends up getting shot and winds up stuffed in a museum. Antel winds up living with the humans, who are all dumb animals, and loses the ability to speak and becomes himself animalistic. Meru maintains the ability to talk, but obviously has to learn the weird alien language of the apes. Once he does that, he becomes a bit of a celebrity, and he becomes friends with an ape scientist called Dr. Zira and her partner Cornelius. They clash up against a member of the scientific establishment called Dr. Zaius. Ulysse has to get off the planet. He takes with him Nova, who is basically one of the mute women of the planet, who he's developed quite a liking for. He gets her pregnant. He takes her back to Earth, but he forgets that actually, because of the time distortion effect of traveling faster than light, while 7 years pass in the spaceship, 700 years pass in real time outside. And so he actually finds himself 1400 years in the future. He goes back to warn planet Earth that if they're not careful, the apes will take over, only to discover that the apes have taken over. And that's the end. Now, obviously, Planet of the Apes, it's got a number of books that it sort of follows. It's not absolutely the most original of plots. So you have the Odyssey, because obviously the main character, there's a reason he's called Ulysses. Ulysses being the other name of Odysseus, the main character of Homer's Odyssey. You could also think of Frankenstein. Frankenstein is also a narrative where some people on a ship find a message, or more specifically, they find a sick scientist. But you have a story within a story. At the end, in Planet of the Apes, the twist at the end of the Planet of the Apes is, of course, that the Starfarers are themselves chimps and find the whole thing ridiculously far-fetched. Because they find the whole thing ridiculously far-fetched because it's a man talking, and that's not a thing that happens. But the main thing I think that Planet of the Apes draws from, and this is kind of important for how we look at the movies now, is Gulliver's Travels. And the story of Planet of the Apes is really Space Gulliver in that respect. You have a character who is separated, shipwrecked, as it were, and stranded on a place where he is not like the other speaking people. He is of a category different. And Gulliver goes through a whole series of these category changes. He's too big, he's too little, he's not a horse. And Planet of the Apes has the same sort of thing happening. So in 1968, when the movie happened, you really had the story of Space Gulliver. Space Gulliver in Planet of the Apes, the 1968 film at least, is played by Charlton Heston as George Taylor. And here he is on the left, and he's accompanied by his two astronaut friends, Landon and Dodge. The first 25 minutes of the film, you see them landing on the planet, you see them wandering around. Eventually, they come across people who seem to exist in a state of childhood. And these people seem to exist in a state of childhood. They seem to exist in a state of innocence, and they don't speak. They're animalistic, although they still wear clothes. And as opposed to the book where they just don't. Of course, it's not an Eden like they think it is, because within minutes, they discover that these people are being hunted by gorillas on horseback with rifles. And Landon and Dodge get separated from Taylor. We discover terrible things happen to Landon and Dodge, but Taylor gets shot in the throat. He gets collected by a bunch of animal behavioral scientists who nurse him back to health, although he can't talk for a bit. The animal behavioral scientists in question are Zira, Kim Hunter, and Cornelius, Roddy McDowall, who Roddy McDowall's particularly interesting. His character is particularly interesting because he's an archaeologist and he's got this theory that's completely novel and looked down upon by the religious establishment, because he thinks that the gorillas might have evolved from humans, or at least from a common ancestor. The religious people aren't happy about that. Taylor, nonetheless, becomes friends. He writes notes to them, he communicates, and they become convinced that he is actually very smart. Although a bit of evidently just a freak. It comes to a head when Taylor discovers that they're planning to neuter him. He runs away, and as he's caught after like an amazing chase scene, he utters the immortal line, "Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape." And that's vitally important because that's the turning point of the movie. And this is a thing that happens in Planet of the Apes movies. The utterance transforms the movie. When someone talks, when someone says something, whether it's an ape or a human, that utterance flips the film on its head. It becomes a different movie. And in this case, you get Taylor suddenly finds himself in the position where he becomes a political problem. He is held up in front of a tribunal of orangutans who hold what amounts to a monkey trial. Cornelius tries to put forward the theory of evolution. Taylor tries to say he's from another planet. The tribunal of wise orangutans see no evil, hear no evil, and try to speak no evil. However, the leader of them, Dr. Zaius, who is both the Minister of Science and the defender of the faith, and so therefore you could say he's the religious primate, is fully aware of who Taylor is and of how apes gained ascendancy on this planet, this far-off planet near Alpha Centauri. Dr. Zaius is played by Maurice Evans, by the way, and that's kind of important later on. And of course, throughout the film, you've got the classic science fiction shorthands, where people on a far-off planet speak English, and Charlton Heston's character, Taylor, constantly says things like, "This is just like Earth, just like a messed up Earth, but obviously it isn't because we're near Proxima Centauri," or "This fossil I have just found of a dead man with eyeglasses and a pacemaker was a man just like me, except not like me because he was from a far-off planet." And in the 1960s, people speaking the same language as you was a shorthand that you didn't bother to go through, because the whole point of learning a language and stuff, it works in a science fiction novel as it does in Boole's novel. But it doesn't work when you've only got 90 minutes of movie, so therefore you just sort of like elide that bit. But what the clever thing that Planet of the Apes does is he spends all that time saying this is a far-off planet, this isn't actually Earth, and it's Earth. And he finds the Statue of Liberty and discovers he was on Earth all along. And I'm sorry if this is a spoiler, but it's a 52-year-old movie with 8 sequels that depend upon you knowing this. So I wouldn't be too bothered, really. Anyway, the point being that it makes the whole of the preceding movie better. the movie ceases to be a piece of frothy kids' space opera and becomes instead an apocalyptic warning. I mean, it's still far-fetched, it's still daft, but the film has all of these points about animal rights, about vegetarianism, all these things. You know, it constantly asks the question, we do this to animals, how would you feel if it was done to you? And over and over again, that animal rights message is reified, it's reiterated and made into something. And also you have this warning that something terrible will happen. We blew up the world, and so the next inheritors of the world took over. Obviously, at this point, Charlton Heston, being a tough guy actor, does what tough guy actors do in films. He punches a beach. Gets down on his knees, punches the beach. This happens a lot in movies. I don't know if you've noticed it, but punching the beach is a thing. Once you've found the Statue of Liberty, where do you have to go, though? What is there next to do or see other than look at the Statue of Liberty and realise where you are and reach a stage of aporia? Well, this is a problem they had, because obviously Planet of the Apes turned out to be an absolute monster hit, and they decided to make more Planet of the Apes movies. Then they decided to make a sequel. So they got on board a screenwriter who stayed with the Planet of the Apes series for the next 4 movies, and this was Paul Dane. Paul Dane was a poet and a novelist, and is probably best known, actually, nowadays, for being the screenwriter of the Sean Connery Bond film Goldfinger. But he wrote a sequel to Planet of the Apes. He tried to get something happening. We got Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Now, Beneath the Planet of the Apes in 1970 starts exactly where the film ended. He finds the Statue of Liberty. He goes off with Nova, who's played by Linda Harrison, and who he sort of picks up in the first movie. And, okay, you've got to realise that the one thing that the Planet of the Apes films are not great on is women's representation, frankly. You know, Nova is the most prominent woman character in any of the Planet of the Apes movies, because she's actually in 2 of them. And she doesn't speak, because she's sort of a hot cave girl. And she's just there to be hot and do cave girl things. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. Anyway, so Taylor's only in it for the first few minutes. He kind of like walks into the desert, and then like falls into a weird atmospheric phenomenon and vanishes, leaving Nova on her own. Anyway, while all this is happening, another starship lands on the Planet of the Apes from 1970s Earth. And on it, the one survivor is Brent, who is played by James Franciscus, and who quickly establishes that he's on a planet which is dominated by apes. And specifically, he witnesses accounts of the war. Now, one of the ways in which you can tell that this film is cheaper than the first one is the fact that if you look carefully at these orangutans, you can see like the 3 original orangutans from the first film around the bottom of the screen. But behind them, all the other orangutans are wearing dodgy pull-off masks. And obviously they're only visible for a split second. So, you know, they probably got away with it. But, excuse me, the future, obviously they didn't see the future where people would be able to pause and rewind. The Council of War that Brent witnesses has a guy called General Ursus, who is starting a war. He's starting a war against the inhabitants of the Forbidden Zone. He's going to take the army along. There is a very pointed scene where a group of chimps try and stage a sit-in with peace banners, and they are framed in such a way so as to look like Vietnam War protesters. There is absolutely nothing about it that isn't Vietnam War protesters, including the way that Ursus and his men just clear away the protesters and trample over the peace banners. Brent finds Cornelius and Zira. Cornelius in this movie is not played by Roddy McDowall. It's the one original Planet of the Apes movie that doesn't have Roddy McDowall. It's a guy called David Watson. And they're not in it much anyway. So he finds Cornelius and Zira, takes Nova to them. They get him out of the city. He goes into the Forbidden Zone with Nova. He finds the New York subway and realizes he was on Earth all along. So this is about halfway through the film. Because obviously, you know, once you found the Statue of Liberty, you got nowhere to go. You know, that's all there is to it. Where do you go once you found the Statue of Liberty? You're in New York. We know this. And then he comes across the inhabitants of the subway, who are these sort of people who talk, people who have telepathic powers, people who can make you see things and make you do things. And actually, it's important to look, these are the three leaders of them, but it's important to look at the one on the left, who's called Albina, but who is played by Natalie Trundy. And she's important because she's in 4 consecutive Planet of the Apes movies playing 3 different roles. She plays a mutant, she plays a human, and she plays a chimp. And no one else does that. And she's in the Planet of the Apes movies because she was married to Arthur Jacobs, the producer. But she's a good actor. She's in these films. She's sort of like one of the things about Planet of the Apes that you find. She's a mutant, and the mutants, and this is important, look like people, but it turns out their faces are masks, and they're actually hideously deformed and hairless, and they have no skin, and they hold church services to an unused nuclear bomb, the Alpha Omega bomb, and they sing hymns to it like all things bright and beautiful, the Lord bomb made it all. They create illusions as Ursus's army comes towards their home. They create this horrifying illusion of like thousands of crucified chimps, and the lawgiver of the chimps, wreathed in blood and fire. It all dissolves into horror and violence. Brent and Taylor both get guns down, as do Nova. Taylor ends the movie dying, bullet in the heart, and with his last moment, he presses the big red button and sets off the nuclear bomb and destroys the planet. The Planet of the Apes is no more. Now, it's a weird film, right? It doesn't know where to go. You have half an hour where you suddenly got this weird subplot with these mutants that come out of nowhere and no actual apes, which is kind of a wasted opportunity when you've got a Planet of the Apes sequel. Charlton Heston said that he was only going to come back and be in the movie if he got to blow it up and die, because he was of the opinion that you couldn't have a Planet of the Apes movie without him. And what do you do? The planet got blown up. Paul Dane was apparently sent a telegram that simply said, apes exist, write another script. And he did write another script. He wrote the script for Escape from the Planet of the Apes. In Escape from the Planet of the Apes, you have a little bit of a retcon. Essentially, an ape scientist called Milo had recovered Brent's spaceship and had somehow managed to retrofit it and make it work. Before the planet blew up, Cornelius, Zira, and Milo traveled back through the opposite direction of the time warp that took Brent and Taylor to the Planet of the Apes, they wind up back in 1971. And they pretend not to be able to speak, and they wind up in an animal quarantine section in a zoo where a couple of behaviorists start doing sort of experiments on them to see how smart they are. And they don't talk until the moment where Zira says, Zira has just done an intelligence test, and she says out loud, "I loathe bananas," because she doesn't want to eat the banana that they offer as a reward for doing the intelligence test. And the two scientists, who are played by Bradford Dillman and Natalie Trundy, are shocked, but they decide to be the advocates of these chimps. And then within seconds, Milo is murdered by a gorilla in the next cage along, which sort of sets the whole thing quite dark. But once again, the whole film is destabilized by an utterance. In the first Planet of the Apes film, Taylor speaks and the apes discover that humans can speak. In this Planet of the Apes films, the shipwrecked foreigner is the ape who speaks, and it's the humans who respond. It's a turnaround. One of the people who is horrified by the existence of these apes is Otto Hasslein. Hasslein is the guy who worked out the theory of time travel. He's a super clever scientist. And in fact, in the second film, Brent actually says, Dr. Hasslein was right. He knew I could get here. Hasslein becomes dead set on stopping the threat that the apes propose to the human race. But the apes have a hearing. They appear in front of a congressional committee. They talk about where they're from carefully, and they become celebrities. They're free to go. They learn about fashion. There's a lovely kind of fun sequence where you see them put on different clothing and watch TV and go to parties and be celebrities. And it doesn't last, because they discover they've got to get away. And the reason that they're in trouble is because Zira discovers she's pregnant, and she's going to have a baby very soon. Lewis and Stevie, the scientists, get Cornelius and Zira into the hands of a very nice guy who runs a traveling circus called Armando, the wonderful Ricardo Montalban. And they managed to deliver her baby, which they christened Milo after their dead friend. And this coincides with the fact that he's actually got a chimp of his own who's just had a baby. It doesn't work. They get caught. They have to go on the run. It doesn't end well. They get guns down. Heartbreaking, heartrending moment where Zira actually winds up throwing the baby into the harbor. And it's all over, except that the final scene shows the zoo and the chimp in the zoo, and the baby chimp, who's being held by Armando's chimp, is there going, "Mama," and starts talking because they swapped the babies. Which brings us to the next film, which follows on immediately, because Paul Dane is made to make yet another movie. But you see, what's happened is that we've moved away from Space Gulliver. The big problem when you have a story about a slave state is that they're using apes as a metaphor for black people. And it's all this great, it's a great, trenchant, powerful metaphor, only apes are black people. And it's made explicit because you've got this guy, McDonald, who winds up supporting Caesar's move towards liberation because he is a descendant of slaves. So he's in solidarity with them because he sees their struggle as the same struggle. And that's kind of something you can't get past. It's kind of a problem. The film goes on, and Caesar starts a revolution. He starts teaching the apes to get smart. We see all sorts of repressive things happening. There's torture. Eventually, it dissolves into a full-on riot. And it's a full-on riot, and they eventually get the governor, Breck, in their hands, and they're all sort of like looming over him with their rifle butts. And he gives this speech about how the Planet of the Apes starts now. And then McDonald says, no, wait, you can't do this. This isn't the way to do liberation. And Caesar goes, oh, okay then, and gives another speech where he says, well, actually, maybe we can work towards a more equitable society after all. And it turns out that that bit at the end where McDonald says, you can't do this, and Caesar goes, let's make a more equitable society, was actually tacked on the end, and the first version of the film didn't have that bit. The first version of the film has him saying the Planet of the Apes begins now, and then all the apes beat this guy to death, which I think is actually a better ending. But it is an ending where it has to stop, and it's an ending that's difficult and painful, but it's an ending with balls. But again, once again, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes turns around when Caesar utters the words lousy human bastards, and no one has heard an ape speak before. And Armando winds up dying in Caesar's place because, he says, no, it was me. I said it. I said lousy inhuman bastards, and no one actually believes him. And it's all difficult. But once again, it's an utterance that causes things to happen. Someone speaks. Anyway, the equitable society is the one that Caesar tries to set up in the final of the original Planet of the Apes films, Battle for the Planet of the Apes. And here you have Caesar's son Cornelius. It's a few years later, and he's going to his English teacher who's called Abe, and he's got his writing practice. And the rule is they're trying to write ape shall never kill ape. But Cornelius has written ape shall never kill Abe, which comes up again in a really surprising way later on. Again, this equitable society is run by Caesar, Roddy McDowall, and another guy called McDonald, who's the other McDonald's brother. He's played by Austin Stoker, and he's probably best known for being in Escape from New York. And, well, it's like Hollywood in the 70s kind of thought that if you had two black guys in franchises, they had to be related. You wouldn't have to do that if it was a white guy. But, fair play to Battle for the Planet of the Apes. The only significant human character who's a goodie is a black guy, and that's got to count for something for 1970s genre cinema. And of course, you've got Virgil here as well, who's played by Paul Williams, and is kind of an adorable, cute orangutan. And they go on a quest, these guys. They go and looking for the truth in the ruins of the post-apocalyptic wasteland, because there's been a nuclear war in the intervening time. Was it caused because of the apes? Was it caused because of something else? I don't know, but there's a nuclear war. But unrealistically, various places where the apes live seem to be untouched by fallout. Anyway, also in the apes supposedly equitable society is the gorilla Aldo, who turns out wants to take over. He murders Cornelius's son, and sort of Caesar's son Cornelius, and he wants to take over and murder Caesar himself while Caesar's away. Caesar and his friends, meanwhile, go to the ruins of the city. You have some brilliant matte painting there. And while in the city, they come across the mutated human inhabitants. You've got Culp, who's actually played by Seven Darden, who's actually he was actually the governor in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. The mutants follow Caesar back to the ape city, but here's a mutant invading army, 3 jeeps, a school bus and a Chevy, and a couple of guys walk in, and it's kind of a disappointing kind of invading army. You can sort of see that they've really run out of budget at this point. Caesar fights the final battle against Aldo. And then there's a closing scene where you see John Huston as an orangutan talking about Caesar's story to the ape children and talking about the possibility of an equitable society. There's human children there as well. And a statue of Caesar is in close-up at the end, and Caesar's statue starts crying, which is, the only time anything really supernatural happens in these movies. So you sort of wonder, does that mean that the equitable society isn't going to work? Are we doomed to wind up with the original Planet of the Apes? Who knows? Anyway, it's about this time that the producer of all 5 of the Planet of the Apes movies, Arthur Jacobs, died quite suddenly and quite young. The films were bought by Fox, who wanted to turn the property into a TV series. So you had the Planet of the Apes TV show. Now, this only ran for half a season, and it ran for half a season. So there's only 14 episodes. It's very much a basic TV show of its era. You have Roddy McDowall, he plays a chimp called Galen. You have Booth Coleman as a councillor Zaius. You have General Urko, who's played by Mark Lenard, who is best known for playing Spock's dad as a recurring character in Star Trek. And Roddy McDowall is delightful in the show, but he's not really the main character. The main characters are Burke and Verdon, David Norton and Ron Harper, who have that Starsky and Hutch energy. This actually predates Starsky and Hutch by a year, but they are basically the same characters as Starsky and Hutch. And it's not that either show actually even influenced each other. It's just how you made TV in the 70s. And the show fundamentally has the kind of thing from 1970s adventure television where once you've seen the first episode, you don't actually need to see any other episodes to understand any later episode. You've got the premise, and then you just they have an adventure. They go to a place, they are involved in a problem, and then Aldo and the gorillas rock up, and then they have to move on. And there's some conflict, and there's a scene where these guys get to whack a gorilla upside the head, and Galen gets to do something for comic relief, and then they move on to the next episode, and everything in that previous episode is reset. And this is, a thing in American episodic television right up until the early 90s, pretty much. I mean, you think of Murder, She Wrote, it's like Jessica Fletcher. Why does Jessica Fletcher in Murder, She Wrote act like she's never actually seen a murder before, even though she's seen like 270 murders by the time that the show's finished. And of course, the answer is it's because in any given episode, Jessica Fletcher has only ever seen 2 murders. The one in the first episode of the show in the season 1, and the one in the current episode. And occasionally you might get a recurring character, and occasionally you might get a character who rocks up in more than one episode, like the episode where they have Magnum PI, who actually turns up in an episode of Murder, She Wrote, and then she turns up in an episode of Magnum, which is kind of mad. But anyway, this is kind of a massive digression. But I mean, even the fact that the showrunners for the Planet of the Apes TV show were Joe Ruby and Ken Spears, who are actually best known as the creators of Scooby-Doo. So they're not trying to have this sort of perverse thing that the movies had. They're basically trying to present a wholesome family entertainment, and it kind of didn't work, really. In fact, actually, when they explicitly do wholesome family entertainment, as they did in 1975 when they did the Planet of the Apes cartoon series, Return to the Planet of the Apes, they did better, because what you had, although there's only 13 episodes, you had an episodic story which had an arc. It was a serial. So each episode built on the previous episodes. And the world of the cartoon series wasn't limited by budget. So you have characters, familiar characters like Dr. Zaius, who is voiced in this by Dick Blackburn, who was a charming guy. I got to interview him, and he was a director of one of my favorite 1970s folk horror movies, Lamora. But Dick Blackburn played Dr. Zaius. He had all sorts of stories. He told me that the showrunner for Return to Planet of the Apes is really important. It was Doug Wildey, and Doug Wildey was the best television animator. He made the Incredible Hulk cartoon, which is actually pretty great. He made Thundarr the Barbarian. He was really good with a line. The world is really interesting. You have 8 mechanized infantry. You have a wonderful arc in a few episodes where the apes actually find a fighter plane and from World War II and renovate it, and you have ape pilots. You have a bit in the arc where the mutants under the ground find Judy, one of the astronauts, and realize that she looks just like this statue of a lost astronaut with USA on it, and think she's called USA. You have the ape broadcasting system. You have a giant King Kong style ape who's woken from being frozen in a block of ice by the telepathic ape llamas who live up the mountains, so he can kill a sort of bird dragon thing. It's just wild. And you have apes in sou'westers. And what is not to love about an ape in a sou'wester? But it's about this point that even though, there's toys, there was Planet of the Apes themed candy, there were Planet of the Apes trading cards. Marvel Comics ran a Planet of the Apes comic book for several years, which carried on for a few years beyond this. But it's kind of the end for Planet of the Apes, really. It's still got a cultural pull to it. So in 1996, The Simpsons did an episode where Troy McClure gets a job being in a Planet of the Apes musical, which is called Stop the Planet of the Apes, I Want to Get Off. And it's got wonderful things like they have like the Dr. Zaius song, which is done to the tune of Rock Me Amadeus. And you've got the amazing line, I hate every chimp I see, from chimpan A to chimpanzee. And you have essentially a wonderful spot on 1 minute and 30 second spoof of Planet of the Apes, which it turns out was largely made by people who had never actually seen Planet of the Apes, but still knew enough about Planet of the Apes to be able to accurately spoof it, because Planet of the Apes had entered the cultural lexicon at this point. So, see, and maybe this has something to do with what happened next. Because, all right, so Planet of the Apes shares something in common with The Wicker Man, which is, of course, one of my other favourite movies. And two things it's got in common with The Wicker Man. And one of the things in common is that my DVD copies have the freaking twist on the front of the DVD box. What is that about? The second thing they have in common is, of course, that they've both got god-awful remakes made around the millennium, made by directors who should really know better, like Neil Bute's version of The Wicker Man, which gave us the immortal line, "Not the bees," which is terrible. Planet of the Apes had its awful remake done by Tim Burton. Here's Tim Burton at the opening party for Planet of the Apes, his version of Planet of the Apes, including two of its stars. Lisa Marie Presley, who was Tim Burton's partner at the time, and Helena Bonham Carter, who became Tim Burton's partner once they finished making Planet of the Apes, leaving Lisa Marie dumped, which is not remotely awkward and probably not remotely linked to the fact that Lisa Marie then did not act in another movie for 14 years. Yeah, it's not awkward. Anyway, Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes is terrible. It is bad. And one of the reasons it's bad is because it's not about anything. You don't have the sort of gravestones draped in the fake cobwebs that you kind of need for Tim Burton movies. It's not really, I mean, you've got these amazing makeup effects made by Rick Baker, but they're inconsistent. Generally, you have, as the lead actor, the lead human is Mark Wahlberg, who's not incredibly charismatic. Mark Wahlberg plays an astronaut who works with chimps, and one chimp who's in a little space module flies through a time warpy space anomaly storm thing, and he follows the chimp through, and he doesn't find the chimp, but he finds a planet which is entirely populated by humans, and the humans talk, and apes who talk more and who basically prey upon the humans and enslave them and buy and sell them. And including Estella Warren here, who is literally in this film to look pretty and not do anything else. And you have Michael Clarke Duncan in it as a gorilla, and he's a really fantastic gorilla. And then you have Helena Bonham Carter, and here she is with General Thade, or Tim Roth, or Chimp Roth, as I like to think about him. And Helena Bonham Carter plays a creepily hot chimp. And see, here's the thing, right? She's kind of got a thing for Mark Wahlberg's character, which is kind of weird in its own right. But like, if you put your hand over the screen and cover her face from the nose down, she doesn't look like a chimp. She's only got a chimp mask from the face down, and she's kind of disturbingly winsome, and it's not right. And it's not helped by the fact that we do actually get to see the chimp, the space chimp, who's played by a real chimp, and that only adds to the fact that she doesn't look like a chimp. So it's like, so not a chimp, chimp, not a chimp, chimp. In fact, her disturbingly winsome makeup, half-human makeup, wound up being reused in a way, in a, well, it's not really spin-off really, in the parody porn movie Playmate of the Apes, which stars late 90s, early 2000s adult film superstar Misty Monday. Yeah, I saw this movie in a second-hand shop actually not long ago, and well, a couple of years ago now, and I thought for about 30 seconds whether I should pick it up for the sake of research, and then I thought, no, research only goes so far. So anyway, going back to the plot of the film, Mark Wahlberg eventually sees the chimp land. Although the chimp goes through the space anomaly thing first, he actually lands sometime later, and Wahlberg takes the chimp space module and flies back through the space anomaly thing and goes to Earth. I mean, he wants to go to Earth because he realizes that his home space station, spaceship thing, has actually crashed on the planet Apes. It also came through the anomaly thing looking for him, only it crashed on the planet, and it crashed on the planet thousands of years earlier. So the humans and apes on the planet are the descendants of the people from the spaceship. So the anomaly sort of turned time backwards or something. Anyway, he goes back to Earth and discovers actually that General Thade arrived on Earth in the 19th century and liberated all the apes and taught them how to speak, and is now in the place of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial because Ape has indeed killed Abe, which is confusing. The final shot of the film, I think, pretty much typifies the best reaction. And I mean, it's the sort of film that makes no sense, and it's there, but you really have to unpack it. So I've made some helpful diagrams. Okay, so Figure 1, how the space storm time warpy anomaly thing changes the order in which characters arrive on Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes. So the idea is that the space storm time warpy anomaly thing reverses and stretches out time. So the chimp goes through first and arrives last. And the chimp, Marky Mark, goes in maybe a minute or two after the chimp and winds up arriving on the Planet of the Apes several weeks before the chimp. But the starship then waits a few days and he's not arrived, so it then goes through the time warpy thing and arrives at the Planet of the Apes hundreds of years earlier, founding the civilization and in fact making the Planet of the Apes happen. On the way back, Marky Mark goes and on the Planet of the Apes and again, obviously goes back the other direction. Chimp Roth, we are led to believe, because he ends the film trapped inside the spaceship, must apparently have spent some time working out how to make the spaceship happen, goes off in pursuit, winds up on Earth 150 years earlier and liberates the apes and creates the Planet of the Apes. For Marky Mark to arrive on there, and I mean, what's the point? It's just, if you need diagrams to understand a big budget popcorn movie, you're losing. You think the Planet of the Apes was over at that point, but what happens in the end is that Hollywood decided to have another go. So 10 years later, in 2011, we got Rise of the Planet of the Apes. And this is, again, rather than doing Space Gulliver, which, really didn't work with Mark Wahlberg and kind of didn't really go anywhere with Verdon Burke in a TV series, and found the Statue of Liberty. So where is there to go with the original movies? They decided to do the other thing, which is a story of how we got a Planet of the Apes and retread that. And so what we've got is Will Rodman, who's a scientist. He's played by James Franco. He's got a dad called Charles, who's beginning to suffer from dementia. And Will Rodman's doing experiments on chimps. And the experiments on chimps are trials for an Alzheimer's cure, which is called ALZ-113. And one of the chimps who is born to a chimp, the child of a chimp who had the drug test, it turns out to be super intelligent. This chimp he calls Caesar, and the baby chimp grows up to be super duper smart, and he takes it home to live with him because it can't live in the lab for various reasons. And Frida Pinto's in the film as well, which is literally the most you can say, because she's not given anything to do, which is such a waste because she's Frida Pinto and she's amazing, and that's not fair. But the chimp grows up, Caesar grows up to be Andy Serkis, and albeit Andy Serkis in motion capture. And that's one of the interesting things about these new movies, is that the chimps, although they are made with CGI, have a sense of physicality to them. They inhabit the space. They create a disturbance in the air around them because there is a figure there. All they've done is change the shape of the figure. So it just so you have this thing where he gets into various trouble. They can't keep him. He gets taken to what looks like a lovely sort of like animal refuge place for apes, but actually turns out to be quite abusive, and is run by Brian Cox and Tom Felton, who is called Dodge Landon, which is a reference to the astronauts in the first movie. And Tom Felton's best known for playing Draco Malfoy in the Harry Potter movies, so you can sort of imagine what sort of person he is. And he's abusive, and Caesar begins to start teaching the apes to be smart. But also, he breaks out and he goes to the lab and he finds ALZ-113. And he takes it back to the other apes. And the thing is, ALZ-113 is being tested as a viral vector. So the apes actually catch super intelligence. He makes the apes smart, but he also makes the apes contagious as well. And this is an issue. Eventually, there's a big blowout finale. There's car chases and explosions and all sorts of things. And the big farmer guy winds up falling off a bridge in a helicopter that explodes and all sorts of nonsense like that. And eventually, Caesar and his friends go off into the woods, and there's a reconciliation with Will Rodman where he basically says goodbye. And the coda is that ALZ-113 is actually fatal to humans. So Will Rodman's jerk-ass next-door neighbor is an airline pilot, and he starts getting the snuffles and starts getting nosebleeds. And over the closing credits of the film, you start seeing a diagram of the spread of a pandemic, because it's actually like a coronavirus. It's a pandemic that causes neurological damage and kills people, while making apes smarter. And this continues into the opening credits of the second movie, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, where we get to see that it essentially causes the collapse of human society and the death of most of the human race. And this is important as well, because in the original series of movies, Planet of the Apes happens because the apes get smart and the human race causes a nuclear holocaust, and the result being a Planet of the Apes, because they inherit what happens when the humans screw up. In the new films, apes getting smart is the apocalypse, because the apes getting smart is a result of the same agent that causes most of the human race to die. And so that's the new Planet of the Apes. And Caesar in this new movie is in charge of an ape society that's sort of like a sort of treetop village. And it is threatened by the appearance of people. Now, this film and the next one are both directed by Matt Reeves, and Matt Reeves is part of that whole scene of film directors who don't direct anything other than genre blockbusters, but who are still sort of seen as auteurs. And I'm talking about people like J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson and Joss Whedon. People who sort of go beyond the sort of thing of previous generations. So, for example, like a Spielberg. Spielberg made family-friendly blockbusters. Spielberg would occasionally make a prestige movie. These guys are just auteurs who make genre movies. James Gunn, there's another one. And Matt Reeves is best known for making Cloverfield. He's also responsible for perpetrating the new Batman movie, as I understand it. But he made two really interesting Planet of the Apes movies. And so Caesar's family is threatened by the appearance of people. And here's Malcolm, and Malcolm is called Jason Clarke, and he's actually a brave and decent guy. And they are coming into Caesar's forest because they want to get to the hydroelectric dam and get it working so they can get power for their enclave and perhaps get society started again. And there's a bit of distrust and a bit of fear, but eventually Malcolm and Caesar create a sort of détente and make some agreements, and that would work out okay were it not for two things. And one is the traumatized and skittish leader of the human enclave, Dreyfus, played by Gary Oldman, who becomes hell-bent on destroying the apes because he thinks it's the only way to make the humans safe, and Koba, who was another escapee from the same lab that Caesar escaped from, and one of Caesar's lieutenants, but who has decided that Caesar is soft and that the humans need to die, and that Caesar probably needs to die as well in order for him to lead the apes. And it doesn't end well. The attempts at creating peace between human and apes are at best temporary. Dreyfus winds up calling in the army from up north, so a bunch of soldiers start coming. Caesar has to defeat Koba in single combat and then lead the apes the hell out of Dodge and go somewhere else where they can be safe. And it doesn't work, and they get followed around for 2 years, and in War for the Planet of the Apes, you finally see what happens when they get caught up. And you find things have deteriorated further, even though it's only set 2 years later. You have the soldiers, the troops, they've got things like Monkey Killer and that written on their things, and they're essentially tracking down Caesar and his friends. You have soldiers who've actually got former members of Koba's faction who are now working for the soldiers in order to defeat and destroy Caesar. And who are called donkeys and who are horribly badly treated, basically treated as slave labor. A colonel who is a maverick who leads a group of soldiers and their ape slaves tracks down Caesar, kills his wife and his elder son. Caesar goes on a journey of revenge. Here he is with Maurice, and of course Maurice is named after Maurice Evans, the player of the first orangutan in the Orangutans movie. This Maurice looks like an orangutan. On the way, Caesar goes on this trip of revenge. He takes his friends with him, Luca, Rocket, and Maurice, who won't go. They won't let him go alone. And meanwhile, he sends the rest of the apes off to find somewhere safe. On the way, they find a little girl who Maurice christens Nova. Again, we've got another Nova, and the little girl can't speak. She's unable to speak. She seems to have lost the ability to utter. In Rise of the Planet of the Apes, there's a scene where Dodge Landon is confronting Caesar as all the apes try to escape. And he says, "Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape," which is Charlton Heston's line. Except Caesar, rather than just take that frankly crappy shoehorned in film reference at face value, Caesar yells no, and there's an utterance as well. The ape can speak, it flips the film around. It's a moment of horror and aporia for the humans, and it's a moment of triumph for the apes. Here, in War for the Planet of the Apes are able to speak more and more. But the humans are beginning not to. We discover, in fact, that ALZ113 has in fact developed further and mutated, and now is coming back and it's being caught by people a second time in order, and when it's caught by them a second time, the neurological damage it does removes from them the ability to have language. And in the thinking of the Planet of the Apes films, the ability to have language is the ability to be civilized. It's the ability to win. The utterance is central. One character who speaks a lot is Bad Ape, and Bad Ape is like an ape who they pick up, an old ape who was from a zoo, and he's really interesting because he doesn't know the sign language that the other apes largely communicate in, apart from Caesar. He can only speak, and so he speaks. And he's sort of a comic relief character, and he's sort of funny and adorable and sweet. But it's kind of nice that when he's being annoyingly dorky, the other apes don't have that sense of humor to find him adorable. They just find him annoyingly dorky. And there's a moment where he gets a pair of binoculars and he's looking through the wrong end. He's like, "Why so small?" And Maurice is just sitting next to him and just goes, and then like turns the binoculars around. The main villain of the piece is the Colonel. Now, he's played by Woody Harrelson, but Woody Harrelson plays him like he's Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. And you tie that up with the militaristic stuff that we see, and the stuff with people painting stuff on their helmets, like in Apocalypse Now. And, you even get that reference happening. So, there's a bit where they come to an underground place and written on the wall are the words, "Apocalypse Now." The way in which the Colonel presents himself is godlike. You have this kind of fascist rally where he gets people chanting sort of vaguely fashy slogans. But look at the flag in the middle. As you can see, the flag has painted on it an alpha and omega. And I can't help thinking that the flag's also back to front. I'm fairly certain that when you hang an American flag like that, the stars have to be on the other side. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm looking at that flag and it's back to front. And there are rules about how to treat an American flag. You can't discolor or mutilate the American flag. You can't adulterate the American flag. That's against the law. There are laws about this sort of thing, and there are bylaws and rules. And I can't help thinking, actually, how relevant this is. You have fascists, hard right people who are adulterating the American flag and using it in a way it's not supposed to be used. And it's really interesting that at the end of the movie, Caesar escapes from the colonel's space by essentially tearing down this American flag, which is on fire. At the end of the movie, the colonel's fascism becomes pointless and broken. It fails. It doesn't work. And this is kind of central to the whole thing. We have this scenario where the apes can speak, and the people who submit to the fascist agenda become silent. And I think that brings me back to this picture of the forlorn symbol of hope, broken and ruined, in front of a man punching the beach. This seems more relevant than ever. I don't know what's going to happen with new Planet of the Apes movies. I don't know how we're going to find something new to say with them. I'm probably going to pay attention. But for the time being, I think they've evolved to a place that is exactly right for where we are and who we are. To the other way of doing Planet of the Apes, which is much more interesting. And actually, you have this kind of like 50-50 thing, like half the movies are kind of Space Gulliver, and we've had 3 movies of that now. But the other half of the movies are how we get to a Planet of the Apes. And that's interesting. That's genuinely interesting. So, we get to Conquest of the Planet. Now, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes is probably the one of the original movies that has the most trenchant point to it. So what's happened, we've moved on 15, 20 years. The baby has grown up. He's been rechristened by Armando Caesar, and he's played by Roddy McDowall again. So this is Roddy McDowall's 3rd Planet of the Apes movie. In the intervening time, all the cats and dogs of the earth have died. There's this bonkers scene where we get to see the memorial to the unknown rover, as you can see on the screen there. Apes have started being used as pets and as cheap slave labor. And here's the thing where it gets really interesting, because obviously what's happened is that entire groups of police exist in order to keep apes in check. because we've got a slave society here. And the thing about a slave society is that its shape depends upon the slaves, and its shape depends upon keeping the slaves in order. So you have these structures, these fascist structures, in fact, dedicated to keeping slaves in order and preventing slaves from rebelling. And that becomes a neurosis for the society. And here we see MacDonald, who works for the governor of the city. He's played by Harry Seldon, a very distinguished actor. And he is a problematic figure because, here's the thing, the film really, really wants to make a powerful point about slavery and segregation and second-class citizens and civil rights. Really wants to do that.